Yes, so like Julian mentioned, I'm also a doctoral student in the project Participatory Image Archives. And my role there, you heard, my background is from design. So I try to address the challenge of visualizing cultural data in a way that allows for the critical interpretation of this data. And for that, I'm actually guided by two assumptions. And the first one is that cultural data is not a mirror of the world, and the visualization is not a mirror of data. So I guess most of you are familiar with the idea that data, at least if we speak about cultural data, is not a natural representation of a pre-existing fact. It's actually ambiguous because cultural data always represents a complex social interweaving that unwinds across time and space and is obviously very context dependent. Creating cultural data naturally involves a process of exclusion, and this exclusion is also related to ideologies, perspectives on life, and also obviously power. So who decides what to archive and what not? So cultural data always paints a very specific picture. Now the same holds true if we think about visualizations, because visualizations there is never just one possibility for a visualization. They are not deterministic in nature. So how you translate data, and especially cultural data, in a two-dimensional space, which colors you use, which fonts, which forms you choose, is obviously influenced by your cultural background, your education, and your motivation. And it determines, at least to some extent, what can't be seen and what can be seen in a visualization. So this leads me to a second assumption which guides me in my research. That is that data and visualization have a constitutional function. So visualizations define and fixate a certain message. So they claim a certain authority over a topic. So if you think of a map, for example, and I show you here one of the maps from the Atlas of Swiss Folklore, which is one of the collections which we digitize and try to represent in an online archive. These maps are kind of visual justifications and demarcation of territory. So you see here, the Swiss border is very present. Everything outside of Switzerland is just a white space. And these maps are very constitutive of the enforcement of rules, of laws and ideologies. So here, for example, you have a map about bäuerliches Erbrecht. So formally, I don't know the English term for Erbrecht. You can ask me later. So these visualizations, they really claim how things work in a certain space. And also if you think of other visualizations like a timeline, it's kind of a visual justification on how certain history, the evolution of a certain history through the display. And visualizations do that by simplifying very complex topics and making them accessible. But now for me, the interesting question is what have been all the decisions that led up making this map, how it was done. And I think this is information you actually need to be able to read this map in a critical way. So these two assumptions, they lead me to the issue or the challenge of representation and display. So how do we visualize cultural data in a way that allows for the critical reading of this data? And I believe that generative design, which is a design methodology I will present to you in a minute, is a possible approach. Now, I also have a second assumption, which is also related to my PhD project, and that is that visual and software literacy are fundamental for an open engagement with digital archives. There are many examples of online archives which have a great graphical user interface and allow for many things to do there. But I also believe that users in the future will increasingly work directly with an API and consume data directly without a graphical user interface in between. And this is for me also related to the idea of sustainability, because the graphical user interface will change over time, while the API will probably be something which is more stable. But we can discuss about that maybe with Julian. So I'm thinking of a methodology to consume APIs visually and to visualize them. And there are some examples out there, for example, the Victoria Albert Museum, who puts a lot of work in documenting their APIs in a way that they are approachable also for people who are not necessarily schooled in computer science and so on. So the second aspect about visual and software literacy for an engagement with digital archives for me is related to the idea of accessibility and also participation. So now I take these two things, representation and display, and accessibility and participation, and they kind of lead me to my hypothesis, which guide me through my research. And the first one, representation and display, is related to two aspects which I think are unique about generative design, and why I believe generative design could be a design methodology to visualize cultural archives. So generative design has two aspects. I will show them to you in a second. So the first one is that morphology and iteration create a plurality of visualizations. The generative design always produces multiple views on a data set. And this is for me why I also believe that generative design processes are observational in their nature. So they are not constitutive, because they always provide multiple views on the same data set, and therefore you are put in the mode of thinking and negotiating between these views, and it's not just one map or one timeline that claims how it was or how it is. So I will show you this idea of morphology a bit more concrete, and this is also where I'm currently at. So this presentation is really a glimpse into my current working process, and obviously there are also still flaws and errors, and not everything has been thought through totally. But this idea of a morphological matrix or morphology was first introduced by Fritz Zwicky, a scientist in the 1960s, and was interestingly adapted very fast in graphic design, for example, by Karl Gerstner, a famous graphic designer from Basel from the 50s and 60s. And the idea of morphology allows basically for the definition of intellectual and conceptual constraints by defining in this box the values of the X and Y axis. And if you combine this then with the idea of iteration, so you go through this matrix and you combine different selections, you come up with different solutions, or different, in my case, different ideas on how to visualize a certain data set. And this is for me interesting because I was always intrigued, obviously as someone with a design background, by the question, why did somebody, for example, Lev Menovich, who does very great visualizations, but for me it was never clear. I couldn't see in the final project what have been the decision-making process that led him to make this specific visualization in this specific way, right? Because there is a methodology behind it, and it's not just like he sits in front of a plain paper and at some point the idea sparks and then he says, okay, it needs to be this and this way. And this idea of generative design for me poses kind of a controlled environment where you come up with different solutions and have to think about why I pick one over the other. So I try to apply this at different levels. I will show two of you in a minute. So I try to apply this to generate interface types. So this is kind of, it's a hierarchy, and the biggest one is basically the interface type, which defines a certain task. So you can do a certain thing in a archival collection. You can search something, for example. Now the interface variant does the same thing, but it does it in a different way. So you still search for the same thing, but it happens in a different way. Then you come to the visualization type, which I will show you a bit today. Is kind of a visualization of a certain type, let's say a map or a timeline. and the visualization variant, it's always a map, but it shows the same data, but in different ways. So today I want to show you what I'm working on to create kind of a generative design system for these two aspects. And I do this on the collection of the Swiss Atlas of Folklore, which already has been mentioned, but it's a very interesting collection because it was actually an anthropological research project from the 30s up to the 60s, and it created 300 different maps, roughly, that portray different things in Swiss life at that time. So what do farmers do? What do people eat? What are their practices and rituals, and so on? And this map depicts this in roughly 300 unique locations in Switzerland. But behind these maps, there is a lot of additional materials. There are notes, transcripts, interviews, even images, sketches of the people who traveled into these regions, collected all that stuff and sent it to the University of Basel. And though the main researchers of this project created these maps out of this material. But in the maps, it's no longer possible to see the decision-making process behind the maps. So what I'm doing right now is trying to create a morphological matrix to come up with different versions of visualizing the atlas. And I will quickly walk you through the different axes of this matrix and then play around with some possible visualizations that could come out of this matrix. So the first parameter of this matrix is basically the mode of the visualization. So you think of what is the aim, or what is the function, the visualization you want to make. It could be explorative, so you don't know really what you're looking for, or you have a rough idea, but you want to basically explore. There is also the idea that you document a certain process with a visualization. The idea of that you confirm a hypothesis, so you have a concrete, specific question and you want to answer it through the visualization. And the idea of presenting, so you're done with your research and you basically present your findings. So these are like classic different types of what a visualization could do. The second aspect is very much related to the collection. So in this, so it's basically, I call it element, but they are the digital artifacts of this atlas. There are, for example, the survey locations and the photographs, the drawings, the interview transcripts, the field notes, the card catalog. That's roughly what comes with this visualization, with this collection, but could obviously change if you try to apply the methodology onto another collection. The third one, I call it components, but maybe context would be a better name. So it actually says, okay, I look at a certain element, for example, the survey location, or I look at the photographs and I do it in relation to something. So I do it in relation, for example, to the language regions of Switzerland, or I do it in relation to the amount of population in the different survey locations, or I do it in relation to the altitude. And this is basically something which could go on, and it obviously depends on your research question and the interest you have. And then the last axis is basically, I call it granularity, but it's like the scope in which you look at the collection. Do you look at the complete collection? Do you look at the group, in this case of maps, a pair, or a single one? Now, let's say we make a super simple configuration. So we say we want to explore the locations of these surveys from the complete atlas, and we would end up with a very banal visualization. So basically just a map with all these points, right? But if we now, and this is, I think, kind of the potential of the generative design approach, or I hope, is that we can start playing with these configurations and end up with different visualizations quite fast. So let's say next to the location, I'm also interested in the altitude of these survey locations, because I think that the people who did the atlas have been very much interested in remote and alpine villages, because they believed that the true culture of Switzerland can be found there and not mainly in big cities, right? So this leads me to a different visualization where basically the x-axis, so the horizontal one, the horizontal one is still the longitude. So it's still from east to west. You have all these survey locations. but the y-axis, the vertical one, is no longer the latitude. It was replaced by altitude, so the high above sea level. So you could see basically how these locations are they like evenly representing the topographic landscape of Switzerland, or is there a certain foci on higher altitude location? This is just, so this is not the real data, it's just a sketch, just as you know. But now if we go even further, we say, okay, I'm still interested in altitude, but the location, I don't really care that much. I want to combine it with population. So I'm interested if the Swiss Atlas is mainly based on not only high locations, but also locations with a very small population. And this leads me then to also replacing the other axis. So now the horizontal one with the population. And I could end up basically, for example, with a visualization that shows me that there is a very high percentage of all the places are very high and have a very small population. And this could lead you then to questioning or better understand or recontextualize these survey locations, what they mean and what they represent and how accurate they are, or for how many people do they speak, which is an information which is not visible if you look at the map basically in a classical way. So this has just been like a quick example. I'm really in the process of that. So yeah. And this is okay. So now the second aspect, which I will just briefly touch because is something I'm still in the process of developing, is this idea of accessibility and participation. So, and this is for me related to the hypothesis that generative design frameworks, there exist some out there, are accessible and inclusive. And this is because I think, for example, processing is a famous, or what, basically the leading programming framework to do generative design. And their intention from the ground up was very open. So processing is open source. It's very well documented. It has a lot of examples. It has a global community. It also actively encourages different genders to participate, especially also women and non-binary people to participate in coding, which is still a male-dominated thing, and also different races, different ethnicities, and so on. And it tries to facilitate and foster access. And it's very a friendly environment to learn coding. And I can tell this from my own experience because I learned coding through these things before I learned like serious programming languages like Python, for example. And there is also a web version of processing, which is called P5JS. And so basically the vision of my dissertation, I believe, would be that I create kind of a hybrid format of a book guiding, but also executable code. Maybe it could be an extension of processing or an extension of P5JS, which is specifically tailored to things you do constantly if you, for example, consume a linked art API or a JSON API with cultural data. There are certain things you have to do constantly before you even can start doing visualization. So could be part of creating helper functions and so on, with the idea that the dissertation ends with kind of a book and this executable code, which is accessible for designer, archivists, researchers, and curators who basically search for a tool that guides them and helps them in visualizing their collections in a way that allows for this critical assessment of the cultural data beneath it. So that's that. The only thing left to say for me is thank you. And if you're interested, there is a little website where you can read more of the theory behind it, which I more or less completely left off today in favor of showing you more of the process. Thank you.